Some promises are meant to be broken, but others will destroy you if you keep them. 20 years ago, a man made a vow to the woman he loved more than his own existence that he would never hurt her, no matter the cost. Count Dorian Blackthorne is a vampire who has never bitten his wife. For 2 decades, he watched Lady Isabelle age while he remained frozen in time, fighting every instinct that screamed for her blood. Their castle became a prison of noble suffering, where love meant denying his very nature. But tonight, everything changes. Dorian stands trembling at her chamber door, no longer the controlled nobleman she married, but a desperate creature whose immortal strength is failing. He needs her blood to survive, and for the first time, he's willing to beg for it. What happens when eternal love collides with mortal time? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The ancient wedding portrait hung in gilded splendor above the grand fireplace, its oils still vibrant after 20 years. In the painted scene, Count Dorian Blackthorne stood tall and proud beside his bride, both of them young and radiant in the candlelight of their wedding night. Lady Isabelle's smile held all the joy of a woman who believed love could conquer any darkness, while Dorian's dark eyes revealed the tender devotion of a creature who had found his salvation in her mortal heart. Now, as the real Isabelle passed beneath that portrait each evening, she could not help but notice how the painted version seemed to mock her with its eternal youth. Her reflection in the ornate mirrors showed auburn hair streaked with silver, gentle lines around eyes that had seen 2 decades of love and loneliness intertwined. Her hands, once smooth as silk, now bore the graceful marks of time that would never touch the man who shared her name but not her mortality. Ravencrest Castle had been Dorian's ancestral home for 3 centuries, its Gothic spires reaching towards storm clouds that seemed permanently settled above the forgotten woods. Stone gargoyles perched on every corner, their expressions frozen in eternal vigilance, much like the master of the house himself. Inside, candlelight danced across tapestries that depicted the Blackthorne family's long and storied history, a bloodline of vampires who had ruled these lands with both nobility and restraint. The castle's halls echoed with the whispers of centuries past, but in recent years, those whispers had taken on a melancholy tone. Where once the corridors rang with laughter and intimate conversation between husband and wife, now they carried only the measured footsteps of 2 people learning to love each other across an impossible divide. Their courtship had been the stuff of legends. Dorian first encountered Isabelle in the village market on a crisp autumn morning, her laughter drawing him like a beacon through the crowd. She was selecting apples from a merchant's cart, her voice melodic as she bantered with the elderly seller about the quality of his fruit. Something about her warmth, her genuine kindness to a simple tradesman, pierced through centuries of aristocratic detachment and touched something Dorian had thought long dead in his vampiric heart. He approached her with the practiced grace of nobility, but found himself stammering like a schoolboy when she turned those bright eyes upon him. She possessed a beauty that transcended the merely physical intelligence, sparkled in her gaze. Compassion softened her features, and an inner strength radiated from her bearing that spoke of a soul unafraid of life's challenges. Their courtship unfolded over months of carefully chaperoned visits and formal dinners. Dorian revealed nothing of his true nature, presenting himself as merely an eccentric nobleman who preferred the night to daylight hours. Isabelle, the daughter of a minor lord whose estate bordered Dorian's lands, accepted his peculiarities with the grace of a woman who valued character over convention. The night he proposed, autumn leaves danced around them in the castle's moonlit garden. Dorian had planned every word, every gesture, but when the moment arrived, he found himself overcome with an emotion he had never experienced in his 2 centuries of existence. He fell to one knee, not out of tradition, but because his immortal strength abandoned him in the face of her radiant acceptance. "Yes," she had whispered, her hand trembling in his as he slipped his grandmother's ring onto her finger. "Yes, my darling Dorian, with all my heart." That night, he knew he should tell her the truth. But how does one explain to the woman you love that you are a creature of darkness, sustained by blood, forever suspended between life and death? How do you ask someone to join their fate to something that should not exist in the dawn light of day? Their wedding had been a magnificent affair, attended by the local nobility and celebrated throughout the region. The ceremony took place at midnight, a romantic choice. Guests whispered, befitting the mysterious Count's nocturnal preferences. Isabelle glowed in her grandmother's pearls and ivory silk, her beauty so radiant that even the servants wept at the sight of her walking down the aisle. But it was in their private chambers, after the last guest had departed, that the true wedding took place. As Isabelle sat before her vanity, removing her veil with careful hands, Dorian approached her with the weight of eternity heavy on his shoulders. "My beloved," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "before we begin our life together, I must confess something that may change everything between us." She turned to face him, still glowing with wedding joy, her eyes trusting and open. "Nothing could change my love for you, Dorian. Nothing." And so he told her everything, the truth of what he was, the centuries he had lived, the hunger that drove his kind, the darkness that was as much a part of him as his heart. He expected horror, revulsion, perhaps even hatred. Instead, she listened with the quiet attention of a woman who had always sensed there was more to her husband than met the eye. When he finished, she rose from her vanity chair with quiet dignity. "You are still the man who courted me with poetry in the garden. You are still the man who remembers every servant's name and asks after their families. You are still the man who wept when old Thomas died last winter, though you thought no one saw." "But I am also a monster," he whispered. "No," she said firmly, approaching him with steady steps. "You are a man who fights his nature for love. That makes you the most human person I have ever known." That night, they made their sacred vow. As husband and wife, they would love completely and faithfully, but he would never subject her to the curse of his bite. She would remain mortal, remain pure, remain untouched by the darkness that flowed in his veins. It was a promise born of love and maintained by iron will, a vow that would define the next 20 years of their marriage. Their daily routine had evolved into a careful dance around the edges of intimacy. Each morning, as dawn approached, Dorian would retreat to his study, shutting heavy curtains against the light that could destroy him. Isabelle would rise with the sun, tending to the castle's affairs with the competence of a woman born to nobility. She managed the household staff, corresponded with neighboring estates, and ensured that the Blackthorne name remained respected throughout the region. Elena, the castle's head housekeeper, had served the family for 40 years and knew their secret well. She watched over Isabelle with the devotion of a mother and had learned to navigate the delicate requirements of serving a vampire master. The other servants, cook, stable, hands, groundskeepers suspected nothing, believing their master to be merely an eccentric nobleman with unusual habits. In the evenings, when darkness fell and Dorian emerged from his daylight sanctuary, they would share dinner in the great hall. These meals had become elaborate rituals of normalcy. Isabelle would eat, while Dorian maintained the pretense of dining, moving food around his plate while drinking wine that helped dull his ever-present hunger. They would discuss the day's events, local politics, plans for estate improvements, anything that allowed them to feel like an ordinary couple sharing their lives. But underneath the careful normalcy, tension hummed like a violin string pulled too tight. Dorian's supernatural senses made him acutely aware of every aspect of his wife's mortality: the rhythm of her heartbeat, the warmth of her blood flowing beneath pale skin, the scent that marked her as his perfect complement. Every moment in her presence was both paradise and torture, love, and temptation warring in his soul. For Isabelle's part, she had learned to read the signs of his struggle. the way his hands would tighten on his wineglass when she leaned close to him, the careful distance he maintained even in their most intimate conversations, the shadow that would cross his features when she touched his arm in casual affection. She understood that their love came with a price, and she paid it willingly, even as the years accumulated their quiet toll on her heart. Their bedchambers remained separate, his by necessity, hers by choice. She had tried, in the early years, to share his resting place, but the sight of him in the death-like sleep of his kind had proven too disturbing for her mortal sensibilities. Instead, they would bid each other good night with careful kisses, their lips meeting in chaste affection that spoke of love held in careful check. Tonight, as Isabelle prepared for bed in her rose-scented chamber, she caught sight of herself in the mirror and paused. When had those lines appeared around her eyes? When had her neck begun to show its age? She was 48 now, no longer the young woman who had walked down the aisle in ivory silk. Time was marching across her features with increasing boldness, while Dorian remained as handsome and vital as the day they met. She had known this would happen, of course. She had accepted it as the price of loving an immortal being. But lately, she had begun to wonder what would become of them as the years continued their relentless advance. Would there come a day when he would look at her aged face and no longer see the woman he fell in love with? Would his immortal heart eventually outgrow its mortal concerns? In his study 3 floors below, Dorian sat before his own mirror, an ancient piece of silver-backed glass that had belonged to his grandmother. His reflection showed the same face that had emerged from his transformation 2 centuries ago. Strong jaw, dark eyes that held the weight of ages, aristocratic features unmarked by time's passage. It was the face of a 30-year-old man in the prime of his strength and beauty, and it would never change. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, the face that looked back at him seemed somehow diminished, as though the careful control he had maintained for 20 years was beginning to fray at the edges. His hands, usually steady as stone, trembled slightly as he reached for the crystal vial that sat on his desk, a vial containing his own vampire blood, sealed away as a reminder of what he chose not to be. The truth that neither of them dared speak aloud was becoming impossible to ignore. Dorian was weakening, and had been for months. The iron will that had sustained him for 2 decades was proving insufficient for the demands of his nature. Every vampire required the blood of their chosen mate to maintain their full power past their 2nd century, a fact he had hidden from Isabelle since their wedding night. Without it, he would not die, but something far worse would happen. He would descend into the madness that claimed all vampires who denied their essential nature for too long. He would become the very monster he had fought so hard not to be. And when that happened, no love in the world would be strong enough to hold the darkness at bay. As the clock tower chimed midnight, both husband and wife sat in their separate chambers, looking into mirrors that reflected the growing distance between them, one showing the ravages of time, the other revealing the first cracks in a supernatural will that had held firm for 20 years. Neither yet knew that their carefully maintained world was about to shatter, or that the promise that had defined their marriage was about to demand its ultimate price. The moonstone pendant had belonged to Isabelle's grandmother, a family heirloom passed down through generations of women who had married into old bloodlines. Isabelle wore it, always, tucked beneath her gown, where its familiar weight rested against her heart. What she had never known, what her grandmother had taken to the grave, was that the stone possessed an ancient property. It glowed with pale light whenever vampires approached death or madness. Tonight, as she dressed for dinner, the pendant felt unusually warm against her skin. The evening began like countless others before it. Candles flickered in their silver holders as servants laid the table with the finest china and crystal. Cook had prepared Isabelle's favorite roasted pheasant with rosemary and winter vegetables, while Dorian's plate held its customary arrangement of food he would pretend to eat, The ritual of normalcy played out as it had for 20 years, husband and wife taking their places at opposite ends of the long mahogany table. But something was different tonight. Isabelle noticed it immediately in the careful way Dorian lowered himself into his chair, as though his usual, supernatural grace had deserted him. His skin, always pale, seemed almost translucent in the candlelight, and shadows pooled beneath his eyes like bruises. "You look tired, my love," she said gently, cutting into her pheasant. "Have you been sleeping poorly?" Dorian lifted his wineglass with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. Sleep has been elusive lately. It was their way, these careful conversations that danced around the edges of truth. In 20 years of marriage, they had become masters of the unspoken, communicating in glances and silences as much as words. But tonight, even their practiced dance felt strained. They spoke of estate matters, the approaching winter, news from the village, all the comfortable topics that filled their evenings. But Isabelle found herself watching her husband with growing concern. His responses came a beat too late, as though he had to fight to focus on her words. Twice he reached for his wineglass and missed it entirely. "Dorian," she said finally, setting down her fork. "What's wrong?" He looked up at her then, and she saw something in his dark eyes that made her blood run cold. For just a moment, his carefully maintained mask slipped, revealing a desperation so profound it took her breath away. "Nothing is wrong," he said, but his voice carried the weight of a lie they both recognized. That was when the pendant beneath her gown began to glow. Isabelle felt the warmth first, then saw the pale light seeping through the fabric of her dress. Dorian's eyes fixed on the growing radiance with an expression of horror that confirmed her worst fears. "The pendant," she whispered, her hand flying to her throat. It's glowing." Dorian rose from his chair so suddenly that it toppled backward, crashing to the floor with a sound like thunder. He swayed on his feet, gripping the table's edge for support, as the color drained completely from his face. "Dorian!" Isabelle was around the table in an instant, catching him as his knees buckled. His weight, usually so carefully controlled, became dead weight in her arms, and she struggled to support him as he collapsed. He was cold, not the pleasant coolness of his usual temperature, but the deep, bone-chilling cold of something dying. His breathing came in shallow gasps, and when his eyes fluttered open, they seemed to look right through her. "Elena!" Isabelle called, her voice breaking with panic. "Elena, quickly!" The housekeeper appeared as though she had been waiting just outside the door, her weathered face grim but unsurprised. Behind her came Dr. Aldrich, the family physician, an elderly man whose discretion had been purchased decades ago, along with his silence about the Blackthorne family's unique needs. Together, they managed to carry Dorian to the sitting room, laying him on the velvet sofa before the fire. Dr. Aldrich immediately began his examination, checking pulse points that yielded troubling results. Isabelle knelt beside her husband, clutching his cold hand while the pendant continued its ominous glow. "How long has he been like this?" Dr. Aldrich asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Tonight is the first time I've seen him collapse, but he's been different lately. Weaker. More." She struggled for words. "More distant." The doctor exchanged a meaningful glance with Elena, a communication that excluded Isabelle entirely. That look ignited something fierce and protective in her chest. "Stop," she said sharply. "Both of you, stop looking at each other as though I'm not here. This is my husband, and I have a right to know what's happening to him." "Doctor," Aldrich cleared his throat uncomfortably. "My lady, perhaps it would be better if we discussed—" "No." Isabelle's voice cut through his diplomatic hedging like a blade. "Whatever you need to say it now, in front of him. We've hidden enough from each other." Dorian's eyes opened at the sound of her voice, focusing on her face, with effort that was painful to witness. "Isabelle," he whispered. "I'm here," she said, squeezing his hand. "I'm right here." "Doctor." Aldrich sighed, the sound of a man about to deliver news that would change everything. The Count is experiencing what we call the weakening. It happens to vampires who deny their essential nature for extended periods. "Explain that," Isabelle demanded. "Vampire nobility requires the blood of their bonded mate to maintain full strength past their second century," the doctor said reluctantly. "Without it, they begin to deteriorate first physically, then mentally." The words hit Isabelle like physical blows. "You're saying that my husband is dying because he won't bite me?" "Not dying exactly, Doctor," Aldrich replied. "But if the condition continues, he will descend into what we call the madness. He will lose all higher reasoning, all control. He will become a monster." Dorian finished, his voice barely audible. "The very thing I swore I would never become." Isabelle felt the world tilting around her. 20 years of careful balance, 20 years of noble sacrifice. And all the while, her husband had been slowly destroying himself to keep his promise to her. "How long?" she asked. Dr. Aldrich hesitated. "In his current state, perhaps 3 weeks before the damage becomes irreversible." 3 weeks, she repeated numbly. "There are ways to slow the progression," the doctor continued. "Certain herbs, certain treatments, but no cure except the obvious one," Isabelle said. The silence that followed was answer enough. Elena stepped forward then, her face creased with 20 years of watching this slow-motion tragedy unfold. "My lady," she said gently, "there are things you don't know, things the Count has kept from you to protect you." "Such as?" "The hunger," Dorian whispered, struggling to sit up. "It never goes away, Isabelle. Every moment we're together, every breath you take near me, I fight not to—" His voice broke. "You can't understand what it costs me to sit across from you each night, to smell your blood, to hear your heart beating, and pretend I don't want—" "Don't want what?" she pressed. "To taste you," he said, the words torn from him like a confession under torture. "To bite you, to drink from you, to make you mine in the most fundamental way possible. It's not just sustenance, Isabelle. For vampires, it's the deepest form of intimacy, deeper than any mortal love. And I've denied myself that for 20 years because I thought you thought you were protecting me," she finished. "Weren't you?" The question came out sharper than she intended, driven by 20 years of feeling like her husband was holding part of himself back from her. Dorian looked at her then with eyes full of anguish. "I was protecting myself," he said, "because if I ever tasted your blood, I would never be able to stop wanting more. I would want to change you, to make you like me, to bind you to this darkness forever. And I love you too much to damn you to this existence." "But you never asked me what I wanted," Isabelle said quietly. The pendant's glow pulsed brighter, as though responding to the emotional weight of the moment. Around them, the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the words that would either save them or destroy everything they had built together. "What are you saying?" Dorian asked. Isabelle looked down at her husband, this man who had loved her so completely that he was willing to destroy himself to keep her safe. For 20 years, she had accepted his protection, his sacrifice, his careful distance. She had told herself it was enough to be loved by him, even if that love came with conditions. But watching him collapse, seeing the pendant's warning light, understanding finally the true cost of his nobility, she realized that love without choice was no love at all. "I'm saying that maybe it's time we stopped making decisions for each other," she said, "and started making them together." The pendant's glow reached its peak intensity, casting everything in pale, otherworldly light that seemed to mark the end of one chapter of their story and the beginning of something entirely different and far more dangerous. The castle's library had always been Isabelle's refuge, its towering shelves lined with leather-bound volumes that spoke of centuries of accumulated knowledge. But tonight, as she moved through the shadowed aisles with a candle held high, these familiar surroundings felt foreign and ominous. She was no longer seeking comfort in poetry or philosophy. She was hunting for answers about a world she had deliberately avoided understanding for 20 years. Dorian had been taken to his chambers, where Dr. Aldrich continued his ministrations with herbs and tonics that might slow his deterioration. Elena had offered to help with Isabelle's research, but she needed to do this alone, to confront the truth about her husband's nature without the protective buffer others provided. The vampire texts were kept in a locked section behind the main stacks, volumes that Dorian had assumed she would never need to read. The key hung on a chain around her neck, another of his gifts, given years ago with the gentle suggestion that knowledge was always preferable to ignorance. She had never used it until tonight. The first book she opened made her stomach turn. Detailed anatomical drawings showed the changes that occurred during vampire transformation. The elongation of canine teeth, the enhanced musculature, the way human eyes developed that telltale crimson glow when hunger grew strong. She forced herself to study each illustration, trying to reconcile these clinical depictions with the man she loved. But it was the second volume that truly shook her. Bonds of Blood, the sacred union between vampire and mortal, described the deep spiritual connection that formed when a vampire chose a human mate. According to the text, this bond went far beyond simple affection. It was a metaphysical linking that sustained both partners, allowing the mortal to share in the vampire's strength while providing the vampire with the emotional anchor necessary for maintaining their humanity. The crucial detail that made her hands tremble was this: the bond could only reach its full potential through the sharing of blood. Without it, both partners would gradually weaken the vampire, losing their connection to their human nature, the mortals slowly fading as their life force went unreplenished by their supernatural mate. "We've been dying together," she whispered to the empty library. "All these years, we've been slowly killing each other with kindness." A soft sound from the doorway made her turn. Dorian stood there, leaning heavily against the frame, his face still pale, but his eyes more alert than they had been during dinner. He wore a silk dressing gown over his nightclothes, and she could see the careful way he held himself, as though any sudden movement might cause him to collapse again. "You should be resting," she said, rising from her chair. "I couldn't rest, knowing you were down here torturing yourself with those books." He moved slowly into the room, and she noticed how his usual supernatural grace had been replaced by the careful movements of someone learning to navigate physical weakness. It broke her heart to see him so diminished. "These books say that our bond should have made us both stronger," she said, gesturing to the open volumes. "Instead, we've been starving ourselves," he finished. "Yes, I know. Then why didn't you tell me?" Dorian sank into the chair across from her, his movements deliberate and painful. "Because I hoped that love alone would be enough, that our spiritual connection could transcend the physical requirements of the bond, but it can't." "No," he admitted. "It can't." Isabelle closed the book and studied her husband's face in the candlelight. Even weakened, even struggling with the most basic physical functions, he was still the most beautiful man she had ever seen. But now, she understood that beauty came with a price neither of them had been willing to pay. "There's something else," she said quietly. "These books mention other couples who tried to maintain bonds without blood sharing. None of them survived." Dorian's laugh was bitter. "Survived is a relative term. Some went mad. Others became monsters. A few simply faded away until nothing remained but empty shells moving through the motions of existence. Is that what's happening to us?" Before he could answer, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside the library. Heavy boots on stone, moving with the confident stride of someone who belonged in the castle but rarely visited the family quarters. Dorian tensed, his weakened senses still sharp enough to identify the approaching presence. "Marcus," he said, resignation heavy in his voice. Lord Marcus Blackthorne entered the library like a storm front, his presence filling the room with an energy that made Isabelle's skin prickle. Dorian's older brother possessed all the supernatural power that Dorian was slowly losing, tall, commanding, with eyes that held the predatory gleam of a creature who had never denied his essential nature. "Brother," Marcus said, his voice carrying centuries of authority, "you look terrible." "Marcus," Dorian replied evenly, "I wasn't expecting you." Elena sent word. Marcus's gaze shifted to Isabelle, and she felt the weight of his assessment like a physical touch. "Lady Isabelle, you're even lovelier than the last time I saw you, though perhaps a bit more fragile." There was something in the way he said fragile that set Isabelle's teeth on edge. Not concern, but calculation, as though he were evaluating her usefulness. "What do you want, Marcus?" Dorian asked. "To discuss your situation, obviously." Marcus moved to the bookshelf, running his fingers along the spines of the vampire texts with casual familiarity. "This noble suffering has gone on long enough. It's becoming an embarrassment to the family name. Our marriage is not your concern, isn't it?" Marcus turned back to them, his expression sharp. When the Count of Blackthorne starts exhibiting the symptoms of the madness, it becomes everyone's concern. The vampire community has been watching your little experiment with great interest, Dorian. Some have been taking bets on how long you'd last. Isabelle felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Our marriage is not an experiment." "Of course it is," Marcus replied with brutal honesty. "A vampire choosing to deny his nature for the sake of a mortal's sensibilities. It's unprecedented, romantic perhaps, but ultimately futile." "Marcus, enough," Dorian warned, though his voice lacked the strength to make it a true threat. "No, let him speak," Isabelle said, rising from her chair. "I want to hear what he really thinks." Marcus smiled, and she saw the flash of elongated canines. "What I think, dear sister-in-law, is that you've been selfish. You've allowed my brother to destroy himself to preserve your human sensibilities when the solution has always been obvious, which is, either let him feed from you properly or release him from this farce of a marriage before he descends into madness and kills you both." The silence that followed was deafening. Isabelle felt the words like physical blows, not because they were cruel, but because they contained a grain of truth she had been trying to avoid. "You think I'm selfish for wanting to remain human," she said finally. "I think you're selfish for not making a choice," Marcus replied. "For 20 years, you've let my brother shoulder the entire burden of your relationship. You've accepted his sacrifice while offering none of your own. That's not love, Lady Isabelle, that's cowardice." Dorian struggled to his feet, fury overriding his weakness. "How dare you? How dare I what? Tell the truth." Marcus's voice rose to match his brother's anger. "Look at yourself, Dorian. Look what this noble martyrdom has cost you. You're a shadow of what you once were. And for what? To prove that vampires can play at being human? To pretend that love conquers all? Our love is real," Isabelle said fiercely. "I don't doubt it," Marcus replied. "But love without action is just sentiment. And sentiment, my dear, won't save either of you from what's coming." He moved toward the door, then paused. "You have perhaps 2 weeks before the madness takes hold completely. After that, no amount of blood will restore what he's lost. I suggest you spend that time making some hard decisions about what you're truly willing to sacrifice for this great love of yours." With that, he was gone, leaving Isabelle and Dorian alone with the weight of truth neither of them wanted to acknowledge. The pendant beneath Isabelle's gown pulsed with steady light, marking time like a heartbeat, counting down to an inevitable choice. The silver athame lay gleaming in the velvet-lined box, its ceremonial blade etched with symbols that seemed to writhe in the candlelight. Isabelle had discovered it in the castle's hidden vault, a secret chamber behind the wine cellar that Dorian had never mentioned in 20 years of marriage. The knife was beautiful and terrible, its purpose unmistakable, even to someone unfamiliar with vampire rituals. This was a blade designed for the sharing of blood, for ceremonies that bound souls across the divide between mortal and immortal. She had spent 3 days exploring the castle's forgotten spaces, while Dorian rested, driven by a desperate need to understand the world she had married into. What she found challenged everything she thought she knew about her husband's family and their history. The vault contained artifacts spanning centuries, ancient chalices, ceremonial robes, books written in languages that predated modern civilization. But it was the collection of portraits that stopped her cold. Generation after generation of Blackthorne couples, vampire lords with their mortal brides, all of them bearing the telltale signs of successful blood bonds. The women in these paintings glowed with supernatural vitality, their eyes bright with shared immortal strength, while their vampire husbands appeared fully realized in their power. At the center of the collection hung a portrait that made her breath catch. Dorian's parents, painted in their prime, his father commanding and powerful, his mother radiating the confident beauty of a woman who had embraced her role in the vampire world completely. But in the corner of the frame, a small placard bore a date that made Isabelle's stomach turn. The painting was dated 50 years after their marriage. According to the family records she had studied, Dorian's mother had died in her 60th year of life, but in this portrait she appeared no older than 30. She chose the blood bond. Isabelle whispered to the empty vault. She chose to become like them. Not exactly like them, came a gentle voice from behind her. Isabelle spun around to find Elena standing in the doorway, her weathered face soft with understanding. The elderly housekeeper moved into the vault with the familiarity of someone who had tended its secrets for decades. Lady Catherine chose the partial bond, Elena explained, approaching the portrait with reverent steps. She shared blood with Lord Aldrich regularly, which granted her extended life and enhanced vitality, but she never underwent the full transformation. She remained essentially human, but with certain advantages. Extended life, Isabelle repeated. How much longer? She lived to be 143, Elena said. She looked 30 until the day she died, and even then, it was peaceful, a gradual fading rather than the violent end that claims most mortals. Isabelle stared at the portrait with new understanding. Why didn't Dorian tell me about this option? Elena's expression grew troubled. Because his parents' story didn't end well, my lady. The partial bond created complications. What kind of complications? The housekeeper moved to another portrait, this one showing a family scene. Lord Aldrich and Lady Catherine, with their children 3 sons, who bore the unmistakable features of their vampire lineage. But something was wrong with the composition. Catherine stood slightly apart from her family, her expression distant despite her youthful beauty. The partial bond gave her longevity, but it also changed her in ways she hadn't expected, Elena explained. She began to crave more of the connection, more of the power, more of the unity that only a full-blood bond could provide. It created a hunger in her that grew stronger with each passing year. A hunger for what? To complete the transformation, to become truly immortal. Elena's voice dropped to a whisper. She began to resent her remaining humanity, to see it as a weakness. The partial bond gave her just enough supernatural enhancement to make her feel isolated from both worlds, too changed to relate to mortals, not changed enough to fully understand vampires. Isabelle felt a chill that had nothing to do with the vault's cool air. What happened to her? She became obsessed with the idea of full transformation. She begged Lord Aldrich constantly to complete the bond, to make her truly immortal. But he loved her humanity. It was what had drawn him to her in the first place. He refused. And Elena's expression grew pained. She took matters into her own hands. One night, she used a blade, very much like this one, to open her own veins, trying to force Lord Aldrich to choose between letting her die or completing the transformation. The silver athame seemed to grow heavier in Isabelle's hands. Did it work? In a sense. He transformed her to save her life, but the process, undertaken in such desperate circumstances, went wrong. She survived, but she was never the same. The forced transformation created a bond that was tainted with resentment and desperation. They lived together for another century, but Lord Aldrich always blamed himself for her unhappiness, and Lady Catherine resented being saved against her will. Isabelle set the ceremonial knife back in its box with careful hands. "Is that why Dorian has been so afraid to share blood with me? Because he's seen how it can go wrong?" "Master Dorian witnessed his parents' struggles firsthand," Elena confirmed. "He saw how the partial bond corrupted his mother's contentment, how it created needs that could never be fully satisfied. He swore he would never put you through that torment. But he didn't consider that denying the bond entirely might be just as destructive. He's always been too noble for his own good," Eleanor said with a sad smile. "He loves you so much that he'd rather destroy himself than risk harming you in any way." They stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by the artifacts of generations who had faced similar choices. Finally, Isabelle spoke the question that had been growing in her mind since discovering the vault. "Elena, if there were a way to create a bond that didn't require transformation or partial transformation, if there were a ritual that could strengthen Dorian without changing me fundamentally, would you know of it?" The housekeeper's eyes widened slightly. "There are legends, stories of ancient rituals that could create what the old texts call willing sacrifice. A bond based not on transformation, but on conscious choice, renewed regularly through ceremony rather than enforced through supernatural change." "Legends," Isabelle repeated, "not facts." "The rituals themselves are real," Elena said carefully. "I've seen the texts, the implements, but they require—" She hesitated. "What do they require?" "Perfect trust, perfect love, and perfect timing." Elena's voice grew grave. "They must be performed during specific celestial alignments, with both participants entering the ritual completely willingly. Any hesitation, any doubt, any coercion, and the ritual becomes dangerous, potentially deadly." Isabelle felt her heart racing. "When is the next alignment?" "The blood moon," Elena replied. 3 days hence." 3 days, Isabelle whispered. It seemed impossible, too convenient, too perfectly timed. But as she looked around the vault at the accumulated history of vampire-human bonds, she realized that perhaps timing was not coincidence, but destiny. "Would you help me research these rituals?" she asked. Elena studied her face carefully. "Are you certain this is what you want, my lady? Once you begin down this path, there may be no turning back." Isabelle thought of Dorian, growing weaker each day, fighting a battle he couldn't win alone. She thought of the pendant's warning glow, of Marcus's harsh truths, of 20 years of love held carefully in check. "I'm tired of being protected," she said firmly. "It's time I protected him for a change." Elena nodded slowly. "Then we have much work to do, and very little time to do it. The ritual of willing sacrifice has not been attempted in over 2 centuries. If we're going to try it, we must be absolutely certain we understand every detail." As they prepared to leave the vault, Isabelle took one last look at the portrait of Dorian's parents. Their story had ended in compromise and regret, but perhaps, just perhaps, her story with Dorian could find a different conclusion. The obsidian scrying mirror stood nearly 7 feet tall, its black surface reflecting nothing but consuming darkness until activated by the proper ritual. Elena had led Isabelle to yet another hidden chamber, this one accessed through a concealed door behind a tapestry in report. The great hall. The mirror dominated the circular room, surrounded by carved symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "The mirror shows truth," Elena explained as she lit candles around the chamber's perimeter. "But truth comes in many forms. Sometimes it reveals what is, sometimes what could be, and sometimes what must never be allowed to happen." Isabelle stood before the mirror, her hands trembling as she held the silver athame they had brought from the vault. According to the ancient texts they had spent 2 days studying, The scrying ritual required a drop of her blood to activate the mirror's power. Once awakened, it would show her the potential futures that awaited her and Dorian based on the choices they might make. "Are you certain you wish to see?" Elena asked. "Some knowledge once gained cannot be unknown." "I have to know," Isabelle replied. "I can't make this decision blind." She drew the athame's edge across her palm, wincing as a thin line of blood welled up. Following Elena's instructions, she pressed her bleeding hand against the mirror's surface. The obsidian glass grew warm beneath her touch, then blazing hot. The darkness within began to swirl like storm clouds, and gradually, images formed in its depths. The first vision made Isabelle's blood run cold. She saw herself lying in the great bed of the master chamber, her skin pale as parchment, her breathing shallow and labored. Dorian knelt beside her, his face twisted with anguish as he watched her die by degrees. In this future, they had chosen to maintain their current path, no blood-sharing, no ritual, just love slowly strangling itself on noble intentions. She aged and faded while he descended into madness, and in the end, they lost each other to the very protection they had tried to maintain. The mirror's surface shifted, showing her a second possibility. This time she saw herself transformed fully, vampire, immortal and powerful. She stood beside Dorian in the Great Hall, both of them radiating supernatural authority as they received supplicants from the vampire community. But her reflection in this vision held eyes that were cold, predatory, empty of the warmth that had defined her humanity. She had gained eternal life but lost her essential self, becoming something that loved power more than the man who had given it to her. "No," she whispered, pulling her hand back from the mirror. But the visions weren't finished. The third possibility showed the partial bond Elena had described. Isabelle enhanced, but not transformed, granted extended life and supernatural vitality. For a time, the vision showed happiness. She and Dorian laughed together, traveled together, shared a deeper intimacy than they had ever known. But as the years progressed, the vision darkened. She began to crave more, to resent the limitations of her half-changed state. She saw herself becoming obsessed, demanding, constantly pushing Dorian for the complete transformation he didn't want to give. Their love curdled into mutual resentment, just as it had with his parents. "The mirror shows only doom," Isabelle said, stepping back from its surface. "Not all of it," Elena replied quietly. "Look once more. There is a fourth path." Reluctantly, Isabelle approached the mirror again. This time, the vision that formed was different, hazier, more uncertain. She saw herself and Dorian participating in what she now recognized as the willing sacrifice ritual. The ceremony took place in this very chamber, with Elena guiding them through ancient words and symbolic actions. But the outcome remained unclear. The mirror showed multiple possibilities branching from that single moment, some ending in triumph, others in disaster. In one branch of this fourth path, the ritual succeeded perfectly. Dorian was restored to full strength, while Isabelle remained essentially human but connected to him through bonds deeper than blood. They ruled together with wisdom and compassion, their love becoming legendary throughout the vampire world. But in another branch, she saw catastrophe. The ritual went wrong, creating something monstrous, a bond that enslaved rather than liberated, that consumed rather than nurtured. In this outcome, both she and Dorian lost their essential selves, becoming creatures of hunger and desperation. "Why are the outcomes so uncertain for the ritual?" Isabelle asked. "Because it depends entirely on the participants," Elena explained. "Their intentions, their love, their willingness to sacrifice for each other. The mirror cannot predict the human heart with certainty." The chamber door opened suddenly, and Dorian stumbled in. His condition had deteriorated markedly in the 2 days since Marcus's visit. His skin had taken on an almost translucent quality, and his eyes held a feverish brightness that spoke of the madness creeping closer. "Isabelle," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Elena, I've been looking for you. You should be resting," Isabelle said, moving to support him as he swayed on his feet. "I can't rest. Not when I can feel what's happening to me." His gaze fixed on the obsidian mirror, and recognition dawned in his eyes. "You've been scrying. You've seen the possibilities. I had to know what we were facing." Dorian's laugh was bitter. "And what did you see? Death? Madness? The slow corruption of everything we hold dear?" "I saw choices," Isabelle replied firmly. "Difficult ones, but choices nonetheless." "Some choices are too dangerous to make," Dorian said. "The ritual of willing sacrifice, that's what you're considering, isn't it?" "Elena, how could you encourage this?" The housekeeper drew herself up with quiet dignity. "I encouraged nothing, my lord. I simply provided information that Lady Isabelle requested. The choice of what to do with that knowledge remains yours." "There is no choice," Dorian said. "I won't risk your life on an ancient ritual that may not even work. I'd rather die as I am than take that chance. And I'd rather die trying to save you than live watching you fade away." Isabelle shot back. "For 20 years, you've made all the decisions about our relationship. You decided to marry me without telling me what you were. You decided to deny the blood bond to protect me. You decided to slowly kill yourself rather than ask me to share the burden. When do I get to decide something? When the decision doesn't involve risking your life?" Their raised voices echoed in the chamber, 20 years of carefully controlled emotions finally breaking free. The obsidian mirror pulsed with their passion, showing brief flashes of additional futures, some where they stood united, others where they stood apart forever. "Look at the mirror," Elena said quietly. "Both of you, look at what your anger creates." They turned to see visions of destruction, futures, where their love died, not from supernatural causes, but from simple human stubbornness. In these dark possibilities, they spent their remaining time together, fighting instead of loving, wasting precious days on arguments that solved nothing. "We can't keep doing this," Isabelle said, her anger deflating into exhaustion. "We can't keep protecting each other from choices that should be made together." Dorian's shoulders slumped. "I'm so tired, Isabelle. So tired of fighting my nature, fighting this weakness, fighting the fear that I'll destroy everything I love." "Then stop fighting," she said, reaching for his hands. "Trust me to be strong enough to face whatever comes next." The mirror's surface grew calm, reflecting only their joined hands and the love that connected them despite everything. In that moment of unity, the fourth path, the ritual's uncertain but hopeful possibility, seemed less like madness and more like the only choice that honored both their love and their individual strength. The golden chalice of binding rested on the altar, a table like a piece of captured sunlight, its surface inscribed with runes that seemed to shift and dance in the candlelight. Elena had retrieved it from the deepest part of the vault, wrapped in silk that had protected it from the touch of air for nearly 3 centuries. According to the ancient texts, this chalice had been used in only 7 binding ceremonies throughout history, and only 4 of those had ended successfully. "The runes will activate when touched by the blood of both participants," Elena explained as she carefully polished the chalice's rim. "Once activated, they will glow to indicate whether the ritual is proceeding correctly. Blue for harmony, red for discord, gold for perfect union," Isabelle finished, having memorized every detail from their research. They had spent the entire day in preparation, gathering the rare herbs and oils required for the ceremony. Tomorrow night would bring the blood moon, the celestial alignment necessary for the ritual to work. But first, they needed to ensure that every component was perfectly prepared, every word of the ancient ceremony committed to memory. Dorian had agreed to attempt the ritual, though his consent came more from desperation than conviction. His condition continued to deteriorate rapidly. He could now barely remain upright for more than a few minutes at a time, and his eyes held an increasingly feverish gleam that spoke of the madness drawing ever closer. The moon rises in 18 hours, Elena said, checking the astronomical chart spread across the table. The alignment will be perfect between midnight and dawn. We'll have a 6-hour window to complete the ceremony. And if something goes wrong, Isabelle asked, then we pray that our mistakes are not fatal ones. The chamber door opened, and Marcus strode in with his usual commanding presence. His expression, however, was darker than Isabelle had ever seen it, and she instinctively stepped closer to the ceremonial implements as though protecting them from his influence. "So," he said, surveying the ritual preparations with obvious distaste, "you've decided to attempt the old ways after all." "Marcus," Elena said warily, "I didn't expect to see you again so soon. I've come with news from the Vampire Council," he replied. "News that changes everything about your little ceremony." Isabelle felt her stomach drop. What kind of news? Marcus moved to the altar table, his fingertips tracing the edge of the golden chalice with disturbing familiarity. "The council has been monitoring Dorian's condition closely. They've decided that his experiment has gone on long enough. What does that mean?" Dorian's voice came from the doorway, weak but edged with authority. He entered the chamber slowly, using the wall for support, but his bearing still carried the dignity of nobility. "It means, brother dear, that you have been given an ultimatum." Marcus's smile held no warmth. "Complete a proper tenure, blood bond with your wife within the next 48 hours, or face formal exile from vampire society." "Exile," Dorian repeated. "Complete severance from the bloodline. Stripping of title and lands. Banishment from all vampire territories." Marcus's voice grew colder with each word. "You would become rogues creatures, without protection, without sanctuary, hunted by any vampire who chose to collect the bounty that would be placed on your heads." Isabelle felt the blood drain from her face. "Bounty? The council considers your relationship a dangerous precedent," Marcus explained. "Other vampires have begun to question whether they too might deny their essential nature in the name of love. This cannot be allowed to spread. So they're forcing our hand," Dorian said. "They're offering you a choice," Marcus corrected. "Bond properly with your wife, or lose everything. The council has been remarkably patient with your romantic notions, but their patience has limits." Elena stepped forward, her aged face fierce with protective anger. "And I suppose you volunteered to deliver this ultimatum personally?" Marcus shrugged. "I volunteered to offer an alternative." "Which is?" "Annul the marriage." He spoke the words casually, as though suggesting a change in dinner plans. "Release Isabelle from her vows, allow her to return to the mortal world, and accept a proper vampire bride. The council has several suitable candidates in mind. Lady Seraphina of House Mordain, for instance, would make an excellent match." The silence that followed was deafening. Isabelle felt as though the air had been sucked from the chamber, leaving her gasping for breath she couldn't find. "You want me to abandon my wife," Dorian said slowly. "I want you to be practical," Marcus replied. "Your attachment to this mortal has become an obsession that threatens not just your own existence, but the stability of our entire society. Sometimes love requires sacrifice." "Yes, Isabelle," said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "It does." Both brothers turned to look at her, and she straightened her spine, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. "Love does require sacrifice," she continued, "but not the sacrifice of love itself, not the abandonment of everything that makes us who we are." "Lady Isabelle," Marcus said with patronizing gentleness, "you cannot possibly understand the complexities." "I understand perfectly." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "You're afraid, all of you. The entire council. You're terrified that other vampires might choose love over power, connection over dominion. You're afraid that Dorian and I represent something that could change your precious hierarchy forever." Marcus's expression darkened. "You overreach, mortal." "Do I? Then explain why the council cares so much about one vampire's private choices. Explain why our marriage threatens you enough to issue ultimatums and bounties." She stepped closer to him, unafraid despite his supernatural power. You know what I think? I think you've seen the same possibilities in your scrying mirrors that we've seen in ours. You've seen futures where love transforms vampire society itself, where the bond between mortal and immortal becomes something greater than either could achieve alone. Isabelle, Dorian warned, sensing the dangerous shift in his brother's demeanor. But she wasn't finished. You're not protecting vampire tradition, Marcus. You're protecting vampire fear. Fear that there might be another way to exist, another way to love, another way to be powerful without being predatory. Marcus's control slipped, and for just a moment she saw the true vampire beneath his civilized veneer, fangs extended, eyes blazing with crimson fire. But instead of backing down, she held her ground. "Threaten us all you want," she said, "but we're going through with the ritual tomorrow night, not because the council demands a blood bond, but because we choose it, because our love is strong enough to face whatever consequences that choice brings." The tension in the chamber grew thick enough to cut. Marcus looked between his brother and sister-in-law, his expression calculating. Finally, he spoke. "Very well," he said. "Attempt your ritual. But understand this: if it fails, if either of you dies or is transformed into something monstrous, the council will use your tragedy as proof that such experiments should never be attempted again. You're not just risking your own lives tomorrow night. You're risking the future of every vampire who might dare to love as you have loved." With that sobering warning, he turned and left the chamber, his footsteps echoing like a countdown to judgment. In the silence that followed, Isabelle and Dorian looked at each other across the golden chalice that would either save them or destroy them both. The crimson rose of truth bloomed in Elena's weathered hands like a flower, made of liquid fire. Its petals seemed to glow from within, fed by the 3 drops of Dorian's tears that Elena had carefully collected as he slept. According to legend, this supernatural bloom would reveal any hidden truths affecting the ritual participants, truths that could make the difference between success and catastrophe when the blood moon rose. But the truth it revealed was not what any of them had expected. "This cannot be right," Elena whispered, staring at the rose's blazing heart, where images formed and shifted like scenes viewed through colored glass. "The flower shows that Lady Isabelle has already been changing." Isabelle, who had been preparing the ritual oils, looked up sharply. "Changing how?" Elena's face had gone pale as parchment. "For 20 years, my lady. The bond between you and Lord Dorian has been slowly transforming you, even without the sharing of blood." "That's impossible," Dorian said from his chair beside the altar. His voice carried the weakness of his condition, but also the certainty of someone who had monitored every aspect of their relationship for 2 decades. "I would have known. I would have sensed it." "Look at the rose," Elena said, holding it toward them. "Look and see what it reveals." In the flower's crimson depths, they saw images of Isabelle throughout their marriage, but viewed now through supernatural sight rather than mortal perception. In the early years, she appeared completely human, her aura, the normal golden glow of mortal life force. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, that glow began to change. Threads of silver light started weaving through the gold, growing stronger and more prominent with each passing year. "Vampire essence," Elena breathed. "You've been absorbing it through proximity, through love itself. The bond you thought you were denying has been forming anyway, just so slowly that neither of you noticed." Isabelle sank into a chair, her mind reeling. "What does that mean? Am I becoming a vampire?" "Not exactly," Elena said, studying the rose's revelations carefully. "You're becoming something else, something unprecedented. The love bond has been changing you into a bridge between mortal and immortal, neither fully human nor fully vampire, but something that partakes of both natures." The chamber door burst open, and Dr. Aldrich hurried in, his medical bag clutched in his trembling hands. His face bore the expression of a man who had just made a terrible discovery. "Forgive the intrusion," he said breathlessly, "but I've been running additional tests on Lord Dorian's condition, and I've found something that changes everything." "What kind of something?" Dorian asked warily. Dr. Aldrich set his bag on the altar table with shaking hands. "The weakening you've been experiencing, it's not just from denying your vampiric nature. It's because Lady Isabelle has been unconsciously drawing power from your bond to fuel her own transformation." The words hit the chamber like a physical blow. Isabelle felt the blood drain from her face as the implications sank in. "You're saying I've been feeding off him?" she whispered. "That I've been killing him without knowing it?" "Doctor," Aldrich clarified quickly. "But yes, drawing energy from your bond. The connection you share has been trying to balance itself as you unconsciously absorbed vampire essence. It pulled that energy from Lord Dorian to maintain the equilibrium. This is why the ritual we planned would have failed," Elena said, understanding dawning in her eyes. "The willing sacrifice ceremony assumes both participants are in their natural states. But Lady Isabelle is no longer fully mortal, and Lord Dorian is no longer fully vampire. The ritual would have tried to restore a balance that no longer exists." Dorian struggled to his feet, fury overriding his weakness. 20 years, he said, his voice thick with anguish. 20 years of thinking I was protecting her, when instead we were slowly destroying each other. "No," Isabelle said firmly. "We were saving each other. Don't you see? My body found a way to share your burden, to take some of your vampiric nature into myself so that you wouldn't have to bear it alone. And you've been giving me strength, extending my life, making me more than I was. We've been bonding anyway, just not in any way the ancient texts describe. But the cost," Dorian protested, "the cost to both of us has been high," Elena interrupted, "but not insurmountable. The rose shows more, my lord. Look deeper into its heart." They gathered around the supernatural flower, which pulsed with increasingly bright light. New images formed in its depths, not of the past, but of possible futures. But these weren't the stark, frightening visions the obsidian mirror had shown. Instead, they saw potential outcomes that took into account Isabelle's partial transformation. "The ritual can still work," Elena said with growing excitement. "But not the willing sacrifice ceremony. We need the equilibrium binding, a ritual designed for couples who exist between mortal and immortal states." "I've never heard of such a ceremony, Doctor," Aldrich said, "because it's been used only once before, nearly 1,000 years ago. The texts are in the deepest part of the vault, written in the old tongue and sealed with blood magic." Elena's eyes gleamed with possibility. "It's a ceremony that doesn't fight the existing bond, but completes it, balancing the energies that have been flowing between you, stabilizing the transformation that's already begun." "And the blood moon?" Isabelle asked. "Is the timing still crucial?" "More crucial than ever," Elena replied. "The equilibrium binding requires precise celestial alignment to work. Tomorrow night's blood moon provides the only opportunity we'll have for months." Suddenly, Marcus's voice cut through their conversation like a blade of ice. "How fascinating. I was parsonating, wondering when you'd discover the truth." They spun around to find him standing in the doorway. But he wasn't alone. 3 other figures accompanied him, members of the Vampire Council, their faces stern with authority and barely concealed anger. "Lord Marcus," Elena said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Council members, this is unexpected." "Is it?" Marcus smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "Did you really think we hadn't been monitoring the situation? Did you believe we were unaware of Lady Isabelle's gradual transformation?" "You knew," Dorian said, his voice flat with realization. "You've known all along." "Of course we knew," replied Councillor Thorne, a vampire so ancient his skin had taken on the translucent quality of old parchment. "We've been watching your little experiment with great interest, a mortal slowly absorbing vampire essence through love alone." It's unprecedented, which is precisely why it must be stopped, added Councillor Vex, her silver hair gleaming in the candlelight. Lady Isabelle represents a dangerous anomaly. If word of her transformation spreads, it could inspire other mortals to seek similar changes through emotional bonds rather than proper ceremony. Isabelle felt anger rising in her chest, hot and fierce. You're afraid that love might be more powerful than your rituals and traditions. We're concerned, Councillor Thorne corrected, that uncontrolled transformations could create beings that fit into neither mortal nor vampire society. You've become something that challenges the natural order. The natural order, Dorian said with bitter laughter, that you've spent centuries maintaining through fear and control. Order that has kept both our species safe, Marcus replied. Order that you've been undermining with your romantic delusions. The crimson rose in Elena's hands suddenly blazed with brilliant light, its petals opening wider as though responding to the emotional intensity in the chamber. In its heart, new visions formed, but these showed not possibilities but certainties. The rose reveals your deception, Elena said, her voice ringing with authority that surprised everyone present. You didn't come here to stop the ritual. You came here to witness it. The council members exchanged glances, and Isabelle saw truth in their expressions. You want to see if the equilibrium binding works, she realized, because if it does, you'll want to study it, control it, use it for your own purposes. And if it fails, Marcus added with cold honesty, your deaths will serve as a warning to others who might attempt similar bonds. The rose's light reached blinding intensity, and in its heart they all saw the same vision tomorrow night's ritual, with the council watching from the shadows, ready to either claim victory or dispose of evidence depending on the outcome. We're not just fighting for our love, Isabelle whispered, understanding flooding through her. We're fighting for the right to exist as we are neither fully mortal nor fully vampire, but something entirely new. The crimson rose crumbled to ash in Elena's hands, its truth finally revealed. They had less than 24 hours to prepare for a ritual that would determine not just their fate, but the future of love itself in a world divided between the living and the undead. The dual coronet of eternal binding lay in 2 pieces on the altar table, their surfaces dark and seemingly ordinary until touched by supernatural energy. Unlike the golden chalice or the silver athame, these crowns held no inherent beauty. They were forged from meteoric iron and inscribed with binding runes that could only be read when worn by those who had chosen their bond freely and completely. According to the ancient texts Elena had retrieved from the vault's deepest recesses, the coronets would only accept couples who had achieved perfect equilibrium between mortal and immortal essence. The transformation in you has accelerated dramatically in the past day, Dr. Aldrich said, as he completed his examination of Isabelle. Your heartbeat has slowed to half its normal rate, your body temperature has dropped several degrees, and your reflexes have become supernaturally enhanced. Isabelle flexed her fingers, marveling at the strange new strength flowing through her body. She could hear conversations taking place 3 floors above them, smell the herbs burning in the ritual chamber, feel the vibration of footsteps throughout the castle with startling clarity. The proximity to the blood moon is triggering the final stage, Elena explained. Your transformation will complete itself tonight, with or without the ritual. The question is whether it completes successfully or tears you apart in the process. And Dorian, Master Dorian's condition has stabilized since your transformation began accelerating, Dr. Aldrich replied. The energy drain you were unconsciously causing has reversed now. You're feeding power back into the bond rather than drawing it away. It was true. For the first time in months, Dorian appeared stronger rather than weaker. Color had returned to his pale cheeks, and his supernatural grace was reasserting itself. But Elena warned that this improvement was temporary, a brief equilibrium, before the final stage of Isabelle's transformation either succeeded or destroyed them both. The council members have taken rooms in the East Wing, Elena reported as she returned from checking on their unwelcome guests. They claim to be here merely as observers, but I've seen them preparing their own ritual implements. What kind of implements? Dorian asked, his voice sharp with concern. Binding circles, containment spells, the tools used to capture and hold supernatural beings who pose a threat to vampire society. The implication was clear. If the equilibrium binding failed, the council intended to contain whatever Isabelle might become, and possibly destroy her before she could destabilize their carefully maintained order. We need to accelerate our preparations, Dorian said. How much time before moonrise? 4 hours, Elena replied. But the ritual cannot begin until the moon reaches its zenith midnight exactly. That gives us time to complete the preliminary ceremonies, but no margin for error in the main binding. They had spent the day studying every available text about the equilibrium binding, but the information was frustratingly incomplete. Only one previous attempt was documented of vampire lord and his human wife in ancient Rome, whose successful binding had created a partnership so powerful it had threatened the emperor himself. The council of that era had destroyed all detailed records of the ceremony, leaving only fragments and tantalizing hints about the process. The preliminary rituals are clear enough, Elena said, consulting the ancient scrolls. Purification for both participants, consecration of the binding circle, activation of the protective wards. But the actual binding ceremony, she shook her head in frustration. The texts speak of perfect trust, perfect love, perfect surrender, Dorian read from the scroll, but they don't explain what that means in practical terms. Perhaps, Isabelle said quietly, because it means something different for each couple who attempts it. They worked through the afternoon, preparing the ritual chamber with meticulous care. The binding circle was inscribed with silver dust mixed with their combined blood, a circle that would either contain and focus their merging energies or become their tomb if the ceremony went wrong. Candles were arranged according to ancient astronomical principles, their flames representing the balance between mortal fire and supernatural ice. As sunset approached, Isabelle found herself drawn to the window of her chamber, watching the sky darken toward the blood moon that would determine their fate. The pendant that had warned of Dorian's approaching madness now rested quiet and dark against her throat, its purpose fulfilled, its magic dormant, until it might be needed to warn of new dangers. Second thoughts? Dorian's voice came from behind her. Constantly, she admitted, not turning from the window. But not about you, never about you. He moved to stand beside her, and she felt the new resonance between them, a harmony that hadn't existed even a day ago. The partial transformation had created a bridge between their natures, allowing her to sense his emotions, his thoughts, his deep and abiding love for her. I can feel what you're feeling, she said wonderingly. Your fear for me, your determination to protect me even if it costs you everything. But also relief? Relief that we no longer have to pretend the bond doesn't exist, he confirmed. Relief that we can finally face this together instead of each of us bearing our burdens alone. And if the ritual fails, if I become something monstrous, then we'll face that together too. A knock at the chamber door interrupted them. Marcus entered without waiting for permission, his expression unreadable. The council would like to speak with you both before the ceremony begins, he said. Let them speak, Dorian replied coldly. They're offering you an alternative. We've heard their alternatives, Isabelle said. Annulment, exile, death, none of them acceptable. This one is different. Marcus's voice carried an odd note, not quite regret, but something close to it. They're prepared to offer you full recognition as a new category of vampire-mortal hybrid, with all the protections that status would entail. In exchange for submission to council authority, regular monitoring of your condition, participation in their research into controlled partial transformations, Marcus's expression grew grim, and reproductive restrictions to ensure that whatever you become cannot be passed on to offspring. The words hit like physical blows. Isabelle felt Dorian's anger rising through their bond, his protective instincts flaring at the suggestion that they would be treated as experimental subjects rather than autonomous beings. "They want to turn us into specimens," she said. "They want to ensure that what you represent doesn't spread beyond their control," Marcus replied. "It's actually quite generous, considering they could simply eliminate you both and claim you died in a failed ritual." "Get out," Dorian said quietly. "Brother, get out of our chambers, Marcus. Tell the council we'll give them our answer after tonight's ceremony if we survive it." Marcus hesitated at the door. "For what it's worth, I hope you do survive it. What you've found together, it's remarkable. Dangerous, unprecedented, and potentially catastrophic, but remarkable." After he left, they stood in silence, processing the council's offer and its implications. "They're terrified," Isabelle realized, "not just of what we might become, but of what we represent. The possibility that love could be stronger than their ancient hierarchies and traditions." "Love has always been stronger than tradition," Dorian said. "That's why they work so hard to control it." As full darkness settled over the castle, Elena appeared to guide them through the preliminary rituals. The purification ceremony was surprisingly gentle, warm oils scented with herbs that calmed the spirit and prepared the body for supernatural transformation. The consecration of the binding circle involved walking the perimeter together while speaking vows that were far older than their wedding ceremony, words that acknowledged the risks they were taking and their commitment to face those risks together. Finally, as the blood moon began its rise toward zenith, they stood before the altar where the jewel coronet awaited. The meteoric iron had begun to glow with subtle inner light, responding to the celestial alignment and the supernatural energies building between them. "Once we put these on," Elena warned, "there will be no turning back. The coronets will either recognize your bond and complete your equilibrium, or they will reject you both with potentially fatal consequences." "We understand," Isabelle said. "No," Elena replied gently. "You understand the risks. The reality will be far more intense than anything you can imagine. The ritual doesn't just bind you together, it strips away every barrier, every protection, every carefully maintained boundary between your souls. You will experience each other's memories, emotions, fears and desires with perfect clarity. Some couples cannot survive that level of intimacy." Dorian reached for Isabelle's hand. "Then we'll discover what we're truly made of, won't we?" The blood moon reached its apex, painting the ritual chamber in crimson light. Through the windows, they could see the council members taking their positions in the past, the courtyard below, their own magical implements glowing as they prepared to either witness a miracle or contain a disaster. "It's time," Elena said, lifting the jewel coronet from its resting place. The coronets pulsed with increasing light as midnight approached, and Isabelle felt the final stage of her transformation beginning, whether they were ready or not. The choice was no longer whether to attempt the ritual, but whether to attempt it together or let the forces building between them tear them apart separately. "Together," Dorian said, as though reading her thoughts. "Together," she agreed, reaching for the coronet that would either save them or destroy everything they had ever been. The sword of House Blackthorne had hung above the Great Hall's mantelpiece for 3 centuries, its blade forged from steel that had been quenched in vampire blood and blessed by moonlight. Legend claimed that it would only respond to a true heir of the house, someone whose bond to the Blackthorne lineage transcended mere blood relation. Tonight, as the equilibrium binding reached its crucial moment, the ancient weapon would serve as the final test of Isabelle's claim to stand as Dorian's equal. "The coronets are resonating," Elena announced as midnight struck. The jewel crowns pulsed with synchronized light, their meteoric iron surfaces warming to the touch. "The ritual circle is active. You must place them on your head simultaneously. Any delay between you could disrupt the binding." Isabelle lifted her half of the coronet, feeling its weight both physical and mystical. Through their growing bond, she sensed Dorian's parallel movements as he raised his own crown. The blood moon hung directly overhead, its crimson light streaming through the chamber's crystal skylight to bathe them in supernatural radiance. "On my count," Elena said. 3, 2, 1. They placed the coronets on their heads in perfect unison. The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. Light exploded through the chamber as the ancient runes blazed to life, their meaning suddenly crystal clear in Isabelle's transformed consciousness. She felt Dorian's memories flooding into her mind, 2 centuries of existence, loneliness, the desperate search for meaning that had led to their first meeting in the village market. But more than memories, she experienced his emotions with perfect clarity. The terror he had felt at falling in love with a mortal, the agonizing self-control of their wedding night, the growing desperation of recent months as he felt his strength failing. Simultaneously, her own memories flowed into him. He experienced her childhood dreams of fairy tale romances, her growing understanding that the man she loved carried darkness within him, her quiet determination to prove worthy of his sacrifices. Through her consciousness, he felt 20 years of carefully hidden loneliness, the nights she had lain awake, wondering if he would ever truly let her close. The gradual recognition of her own changing nature, the fierce protectiveness that made her willing to risk everything rather than watch him fade. "Perfect equilibrium," Elena whispered in wonder. "The coronets accept you both." But even as the binding stabilized, warning bells rang throughout the castle. Through the chamber windows, they could see torches blazing in the courtyard as vampire houses opposed to their union arrived in force. The council had not come alone, they had brought reinforcements. "House Maledict?" Dorian said grimly, his enhanced senses identifying the newcomers. "Lord Cassius leads them personally. He's always been the most traditional of the old blood." "How many? How many?" Isabelle asked, surprised by the calmness in her own voice. The coronet had not only stabilized her transformation, but enhanced her natural courage. 3 dozen, perhaps more. They've surrounded the castle. Through the great hall's windows, they could see Lord Cassius Maledict addressing the assembled. Vampire nobility, his voice, supernaturally enhanced, carried clearly to their ears. "Too long have we tolerated this mockery of our ancient ways," he declared. "Tonight, we reclaim the honor of vampire society by ending this abomination before it can spread further." "They mean to attack," Elena said. "The binding ritual has made you both more powerful, but we're still only 2 against 3 dozen, Dorian finished. "And some of them are older and stronger than I am." Isabelle felt the sword calling to her not with words, but with a resonance that matched the frequency of her transformed nature. Without conscious thought, she moved toward the great hall, where the ancient weapon waited. "Isabelle, what are you doing?" "The sword," she said, her voice carrying new authority. "I can feel it. It's part of the binding ritual, the final test." They descended to the great hall, where moonlight streamed through tall windows to illuminate the Blackthorne ancestral weapon. As Isabelle approached, the sword began to glow with the same light that emanated from their coronets. "The blade chooses its wielder," Elena breathed. "No one has been able to draw it from its mounting since Lord Aldrich died 30 years ago." Isabelle reached for the sword's hilt. The metal felt warm and alive beneath her touch, responding to the dual nature of her existence, part mortal determination, part vampire power. As her fingers closed around the grip, the weapon sang with harmonics that resonated through the castle's stone walls. She drew the blade free with a sound like thunder. Light blazed from the steel, and she felt the sword's power flowing into her through the bond she now shared with Dorian. This was not mere physical strength, but the accumulated might of generations of Blackthorne lords who had wielded justice and protection in equal measure. "By the ancient laws," came a voice from the courtyard, "I claim the right of challenge." Lord Cassius stood in the castle's entrance hall, his own blade drawn, his eyes blazing with centuries of aristocratic fury. You seek to legitimize this perversion with our oldest traditions? He continued. Very well, let the sword prove whether this mortal deserves to call herself Blackthorne. Isabelle, Dorian said urgently. You don't have to. Yes, she replied firmly. I do. The sword pulsed in her grip, its light matching the rhythm of her transformed heartbeat. The blood crystal of House Unity began to form as the first blades clashed, its ethereal structure materializing in the air above the great hall, like a constellation-given substance. According to the most ancient vampire laws, this crystal would only manifest when the ceremony it witnessed was blessed by the deepest magic of their kind, a validation that transcended any earthly authority, including that of the Vampire Council. Lord Cassius fought with the skill of 5 centuries, his blade singing through the air with lethal precision. But Isabelle found herself moving with fluid grace she had never possessed as a mortal, the sword of House Blackthorne, guiding her movements as much as her own will. Through her bond with Dorian, she could feel his tactical knowledge flowing into her consciousness, centuries of combat experience, strategic thinking, and supernatural reflexes, combining with her own fierce determination to protect what they had built together. Impossible, Cassius snarled as she parried his strike and responded with a riposte that opened a line across his cheek. No mortal should be able to match vampire speed. I'm not mortal anymore, Isabelle replied, her voice steady despite the intensity of the combat. And I'm not vampire either. I'm something new. Around them, the assembled vampire houses watched in stunned silence. This was not the execution they had expected to witness, but a true contest between equals. The blood crystal continued to grow overhead, its faceted surface reflecting the moonlight in patterns that spoke of cosmic approval. Cassius pressed his attack, driving Isabelle back toward the great fireplace where the ancient wedding portrait still hung. But instead of retreating further, she used the wall to her advantage, pushing off with supernatural strength to launch herself over his head in a move that would have been impossible for any purely mortal fighter. You cannot win, Cassius called out as they circled each other. Even if you defeat me, there are 36 more who will never accept what you represent. Then they'll have to defeat us both, Dorian said, stepping into the hall with his own blade drawn. The coronet on his head blazed with renewed light as he moved to stand beside his wife. The blood crystal above them pulsed in response, growing larger and more brilliant as their combined presence strengthened its manifestation. 2 against 1 is hardly honorable, Marcus observed from his position with the vampire council, but his tone carried admiration rather than criticism. 2 as 1, Isabelle corrected. That's what the binding has made us. She was right. As they fought side by side, their movements synchronized with supernatural precision. Where Dorian struck high, she struck low. When she pressed forward, he covered her retreat. The sword in her hands seemed to communicate with his blade, both weapons singing in harmony as they wove a pattern of defense and attack that no single opponent could penetrate. Lord Cassius was skilled, ancient, and powerful, but he was fighting against something that had never existed before in vampire history. The equilibrium binding had created not just a married couple, but a unified force that drew strength from both mortal determination and immortal power. The blood crystal reached its full size, hovering 20 feet above the hall, like a supernatural chandelier. Its light illuminated faces throughout the assembled crowd, some shocked, others awed, a few beginning to show the grudging respect that came with witnessing something unprecedented and magnificent. "Enough!" Cassius roared, his fury overwhelming his tactical thinking. He launched himself at Isabelle in a reckless charge that left him open to counterattack. She could have killed him. The sword in her hands thrummed with deadly power, and her enhanced reflexes gave her the speed to strike before he could recover his defense. Instead, she chose mercy, a move that spoke to the mortal heart that still beat within her transformed body. Her blade struck the flat of his sword rather than his flesh, the impact sending his weapon spinning away to clatter across the stone floor. In the same motion, she brought her point to rest against his throat, not breaking the skin, but making clear that she could have ended his life if she had chosen to do so. "I don't want to kill you, Lord Cassius," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "I want you to understand. The love that Dorian and I share doesn't threaten vampire tradition, it expands it. It proves that your kind can grow beyond what you've always been, without losing what makes you powerful." The blood crystal above them reached perfect clarity, its surface reflecting not the assembled crowd, but visions of possible futures, vampire society, enriched by bonds like theirs. Mortals and immortals, working together rather than existing in eternal separation. Love becoming a bridge between worlds rather than a barrier. "The crystal has formed completely," Elena announced from her position near the altar. "The binding is recognized by the oldest magic of the vampire bloodlines. What has been joined tonight cannot be severed by any earthly authority." Cassius looked up at the crystal, then at the blade touching his throat, then into Isabelle's eyes, where he saw not conquest, but compassion. "You could have killed me," he said quietly. "Killing you would have proven nothing, except that power corrupts," she replied. "Sparing you proves that power can also choose mercy." Slowly, she withdrew the sword and stepped back, offering him the chance to retrieve his weapon and his dignity. The great hall remained silent as vampire society confronted a new reality, one where strength showed itself through restraint, where victory chose reconciliation over domination, and where love had proven itself stronger than centuries of tradition. The mirror of eternal moments had appeared in their private chambers without fanfare or ceremony, manifesting as naturally as dawn follows night. Unlike the other artifacts that had marked their journey, this mirror bore no ancient inscriptions or mystical properties. It simply existed as a reflection of what they had become. When Isabelle looked into its surface, she saw not just her own face, but Dorian's as well, their images overlapping in perfect harmony, regardless of where he stood in the room. 3 months had passed, since the night of the blood moon, and Ravencrest Castle had transformed into something no vampire stronghold had ever been before. The great hall, once austere and imposing, now buzzed with activity as representatives from both mortal and vampire communities came seeking guidance on matters that bridged their two worlds. The equilibrium binding had done more than save their marriage. It had created a new model for supernatural diplomacy. "Another request from the Council of Venice," Elena announced as she entered their shared study with the morning correspondence. "They're asking for mediation in a dispute between a vampire house and the city's merchant guild." "Third one this week," Dorian observed, looking up from the estate ledgers, where he recorded not just financial matters, but the careful negotiations required to maintain peace between worlds. "Word is spreading faster than we anticipated." Isabelle smiled as she reviewed a letter from the Archbishop of Canterbury, a D3, mortal clergyman seeking advice on how his church might better serve parishioners who had chosen vampire bonds. The irony wasn't lost on her that a woman who had once known nothing of supernatural politics was now consulted on matters of spiritual significance by the highest authorities of both species. "Marcus sends word from the Vampire Council," Dorian said, reviewing his own correspondence. "They've formally recognized our union as the first of its kind, a new category of supernatural bond that doesn't require transformation or traditional feeding relationships." And what does that mean? Practically, it means other couples can attempt similar bonds without fear of persecution. It means the Council is officially abandoning their prohibition on vampire mortal marriages that don't follow the classical patterns. He paused, his expression growing thoughtful. "It means we've changed vampire society more than either of us ever imagined possible. Through the window, they could see the castle grounds, where an unusual scene played out daily, vampire lords and ladies mingling freely with mortal dignitaries. their children playing together without the ancient barriers that had once separated their kinds. The sight filled Isabelle with quiet satisfaction, knowing that what had begun as a desperate attempt to save their love had evolved into something that offered hope to countless others. "Do you ever miss it?" Dorian asked quietly. "Your mortal life? The simplicity of existing in only one world?" Isabelle moved to stand beside him, and automatically their reflections appeared together in the mirror of eternal moments that hung on the far wall. In its surface, she could see not just who they were now, but echoes of who they had been. The young woman who had fallen in love with a mysterious nobleman, the vampire who had believed he could protect what he loved by holding it at arm's length. "I miss the innocence," she said honestly. There was something peaceful about not knowing how complicated love could become when it crossed the boundaries between species. "But I wouldn't trade what we have now for that simplicity, even though the transformation changed you in ways we still don't fully understand." She considered the question seriously. The equilibrium binding had left her with enhanced senses, supernatural strength, and a lifespan that would stretch for centuries rather than decades. But more than that, it had given her access to depths of emotion and connection she had never imagined possible. Through their bond, she experienced Dorian's love not as words or gestures, but as a living force that sustained her very existence. "The transformation didn't change who I am," she said finally. "It revealed who I was always meant to become." A soft knock interrupted their conversation. Elena entered with a young couple, a nervous vampire lord who appeared barely older than 20, and a mortal woman whose eyes held the determined gleam of someone who had made a difficult but certain choice. "Lord Stefan and Miss Catherine have come seeking guidance," Elena announced. "They wish to attempt their own equilibrium binding." Isabelle felt Dorian's satisfaction through their bond as they welcomed the young couple. In the 3 months since their own ceremony, 17 similar pairs had made the journey to Ravencrest Castle, seeking to create bonds that honored both their supernatural nature and their mortal hearts. 13 had succeeded a remarkable percentage, considering the complexity of the ritual and the perfect trust it required. "The blood moon won't rise again for several months," Dorian explained to the hopeful couple. "But there are other celestial alignments that can support the binding, and we've learned much about how to prepare for the ritual in the time since our own ceremony." As they began the consultation, Isabelle caught sight of their reflection in the mirror of eternal moments. But now, the glass showed more than just her face and Dorian's. It revealed the faces of all the couples they had helped, all the bonds they had witnessed, all the love they had made possible by proving that connection could transcend the boundaries between worlds. "You know what I realized today?" she said to Dorian during a quiet moment between appointments. "What's that? We're not the same people who made that promise on our wedding night 23 years ago. We're not even the same people who attempted the equilibrium binding 3 months ago." She gestured toward the mirror, where their unified reflection smiled back at them. "We're something entirely new, something created not by the transformation itself, but by the choice to grow together instead of apart." "And you're content with what we've become?" Isabelle looked around their study, filled with correspondence from across Europe, requests for guidance that honored their hard-won wisdom, evidence of a love that had grown beyond personal happiness to become a force for positive change in both their worlds. "I'm more than content," she said, reaching for his hand. "I'm grateful. We set out to save our marriage, and instead, we discovered that true love doesn't just survive change. It creates possibilities that didn't exist before." In the mirror of eternal moments, their reflections nodded in perfect agreement. Two souls united in a bond that had transcended every limitation placed upon it, creating hope where once there had been only tradition, love where once there had been only fear,